So recently Jordan Peterson was presented with a question from Ricardo Duchesne on the topic of Western civilization and whether or not it is appropriate for us to take pride in the achievements of Western civilization.
Professor Ricardo Duchesne, a historical sociologist and professor at the University of New Brunswick, argues that, quote, individualism is a unique attribute of European peoples. Quote, it has been exported to some degree to other nations, but in my view, it is not something that comes to them naturally. So, he continues, quote, you can't play the game of we're all individuals. We have to affirm and be proud of our ethnic identity and heritage to preserve the West's curious individualism.
He quite vigorously denounced the idea that we can validly take pride in the achievements of Western civilization or European civilization.
Okay, having said that, it's like, am I proud of that? It's like, I didn't do that. What the hell? Pride. What's that? That's not the right response. That's nothing to be proud of. That's something to tremble before, to take on as an ethical burden, and not to wave a flag for how wonderful you are that you happen to have the same skin color as some of the people who thought that up. It's not the right response. And so these right-wingers in this, it's like, look what we've done. It's like, no, it's not you that did that. That's something, man. You gotta have your act together before you would dare to say, well, that was me. It's like, yeah, sure it was you. Yeah, right. No, that's hard to stand up and take your place in that kind of historical process, that unlikely, miraculous historical process. Not to just feel ashamed at the way that you're presently constituted in the face of that means that you're deluded, and you're using your great fortune at being a beneficiary of that system. Look at what we've got here, this great peace that we're inhabiting right now. You're using your the unearned gift that's been granted to you as a source of personal pride in your accomplishments due to your skin.
So this is my response to Jordan Peterson. So as far as I can understand, Jordan Peterson's fundamental proof for his belief in religion is that its positive effect on people is some kind of proof of its metaphysical truth. So under a system like Christianity, which he seems to believe maps out our emergent human nature and therefore possibly springs from some shared metaphysical origin, his central argument, it seems to me, is something along the lines of religion works and is positive for us, so on some level this is evidence that it is, quote, true. So in response to his condemnation of the idea of taking collective pride in the achievements of Western civilization, let's imagine a young boy looking up at the massive visage of a European cathedral. He's awed at its aesthetic, mathematical and engineering achievements. Now let's imagine two possible conceptual responses and what emotional response would likely follow each conceptualization. Conceptualization 1. I am an individual. I personally took no action to build this. I fronted no cost, made no investment, and so while I am awed by the achievements and beauty in front of me, I contributed nothing to this and I have no ownership over it. Whilst I can appreciate what I see, much in the same way that I can appreciate any other achievement of people from all around the world equally, I have no legitimate reason at all to feel proud of what I'm seeing. Therefore, any feeling of pride, ownership or investment in this I may feel is invalid. Or conceptualization 2. This is an achievement of my people, and since I have an investment in and some ownership over my people and our culture and norms, etc., thus I have an investment in and some ownership of this stunning achievement before me. It is a physical manifestation of our capacities for excellence and beauty, and so if people from my tribe could achieve such a thing, and I come from the same stock, surely I must have it in me to achieve similar greatness, or at least aid in its maintenance and defense. It is a product of my people, therefore I have some level of ownership over it, and therefore it is valid for me to invest in and defend this. In conceptualization 1, any ownership that the observing individual might feel is invalid, and even in fact immoral, presented by Peterson as a kind of theft on the achievements of other individuals, and an unfounded bigotry against the achievements of people from outside your tribe. However, in conceptualization 2, the observing individual feels a sense of ownership, and this ownership is an expectation that investment into this property will yield returns for him in the future. This then creates an incentive for him to contribute to its maintenance and defence. Libertarians are very well aware of the political scenario called the problem of the commons, which explains that we are all individual actors who seek to maximise our own returns on investments, and when property is not owned by anyone directly, when no one is directly responsible for the costs of its maintenance or defence, and no one can legitimately expect to make returns on its continued profitability into the future, this removes any incentive from people to maintain or defend a resource. Now, I know that the problem of the commons refers to common property, and that is not a direct analogy to this scenario because Peterson is advocating individualist pride or ownership, but I merely want to highlight the argument that removing ownership over a thing removes the incentive to invest in, maintain or defend a thing, and that individualists fully understand and employ this argument regularly. So now imagine that over the many centuries of human civilization, these norms around property and ownership emerge from an evolutionary process, where norms that preserve what people value are sustained, and those that don't are lost to history, either by being abandoned as ineffective, or because the populations that employed them were conquered by others with more effective norms. Peterson is correct that being proud of something implies some kind of personal achievement or ownership. But this implied sense of ownership incentivizes investment in, maintenance and defense of the property which an individual feels ownership over, because this ownership is an expectation of returns from the future profitability of that property or commons. Now, this property could be something tangible like a church, territory or infrastructure, but it could also be many intangible things like social norms, reputation, cultural identity, political philosophy, property norms, etc. And the returns that he expects may not be simply monetary, they may also be intangible, such as a sense of identity or kinship with others, preservation of culture, preservation of property rights, community standing, etc. So the individualist's stance that collective pride is invalid and immoral strips the individual of any ownership and therefore disincentivizes any investment, maintenance or defense of property and culture. But the individual that feels pride at the achievements of his people is incentivized to invest in, maintain and defend that which he feels pride in. And so all forms of commons which people feel pride in, ownership of and thus a willingness to defend will necessarily over time outcompete those commons which people of a polity do not feel ownership of and thus are not incentivized to defend. And so to employ Peterson's main premise on religion, something like if it works, that is some kind of evidence that it is also true, then if collective pride in commons will outcompete extreme individualism, then by Peterson's own premise, that is also a valid and valuable way for people to act if you value the investment in, maintenance and defense of, say, Western civilization, which Peterson claims that he does value. Now, to go a level deeper, not only is collective pride useful, but it is also legitimate. When you look at an achievement, such as the building of a cathedral, one of the factors that enabled this to come into existence was the fact that it was able to be built at all. By which I mean the investors, designers, architects, builders and artisans, etc. were all able to act free from violence, whether due to high trust societal norms and laws, or also free from the outside violence of conquest by a competing group, which would never permit a cathedral to be built because they likely have a different religion and culture with different values and aesthetics and a different metaphysics entirely to glorify. And so, in a very real sense, whenever a citizen of a polity acts in a trustworthy and lawful manner, they are contributing to the societal commons of high trust and lawfulness, which is a necessary condition for such things as cathedrals, markets, wealth, philosophies, property rights, the rule of law, etc. to take place. And this contribution, even though small, is a contributing factor to enabling such larger accomplishments. Acting in a way that reinforces high trust, lawfulness and property norms is the personal action that legitimizes the individual's sense of ownership and therefore pride over the commons. And should that individual ever take up arms to physically defend their polity, or even just be prepared to take up arms because threats of violence are a deterrent, then they are contributing once again to the preconditions that make such commons possible. And pride in or ownership of these commons is one of the small ways in which people are paid for their willingness to take these actions. And I think this is the key to understanding the injustice that many people intuit when faced with Peterson's denunciation of collective pride. He seems to be quite willing to moralise to people that they should act in ways that preserve the preconditions for commons to exist, such as respecting property rights, exchanging in markets, telling the truth, etc., etc., yet wants to withhold payment from people for doing so in the form of pride and ownership of the accomplishments. He also says that he values the defence and maintenance of Western civilization, yet also speaks to undermine the basic reciprocity that would incentivise this defence and maintenance. And I think this unintentional disingenuousness is what makes this type of thing so unsettling to conservative types. To add a third and much more abstract layer to this analysis, bear with me, value itself is subjective, and the process of something reaching a state where it is recognised as being commonly valued highly among a people is simply the result of many individuals valuing it. So every person who values something and acts in a way that signals that they value it to other people has in a very minute way contributed to its perceived value among a people. So in a strange way, maybe the act of conferring value onto something could be seen as one small action for which pride in it is the reciprocal payment. Or in other words, maybe by the simple act of wanting to take pride in something, you are adding to its perceived value in the future. You are further incentivizing its maintenance and defense, and you're also staking a claim or a promise that you will act to maintain or defend that which you want to take pride in. To put this in a real-world example, a European cathedral is recognised to have value to European people because enough of them value it relative to other things. And so every person who signals that they value it is contributing to its perceived value within the community, which once again contributes to its continued existence relative to other things that could exist now or in the future. Admittedly, this is possibly the smallest thing possible that might warrant being able to, quote, take pride in a commons, but even this is still something. And so, in conclusion, despite having many valuable arguments, Peterson is wrong on this, and destructively so. And I think a quick examination of his later comments in the clip show that he's likely feeling a cognitive dissonance between his desire to preserve Western culture and his value of egalitarianism. The idea that you cannot take pride in your civilizational commons is, I think, possibly just a projection from leftists, because on some level they intuit that they in fact don't deserve to take pride in them. They are often parasites on the public purse, taking more in taxes than they contribute, or flocking to subsidised, make-work bureaucratic jobs, which are usually mostly shielded from market forces and thus tests of reciprocity. And they often act and speak in low-trust ways, so as to erode commons like in-group trust and thus weaken the defences of their hosts, the productive. And Peterson seems to speak from a curious mix of left-wing egalitarianism and right-wing hierarchy. This is also evident in his regurgitation of the common leftist canard that the only difference between groups is, quote, skin colour. He knows full well that personality traits and IQ have some genetic basis, and that researchers like Ricardo Duchesne, Kurt Doolittle, Kevin MacDonald and others delve much further into group differences than most would be comfortable understanding. But certainly Peterson knows better than to claim the only difference between groups is something as arbitrary and meaningless as skin colour. And so you can see where he really just starts to completely bitch out in this exchange, which is unfortunate. To go back to the example of the constructed cathedral, if certain genetic predispositions in personality and brain traits are a contributing factor to the creation of social norms, such as high trust, property rights, markets, lawfulness, etc., and that these norms are a precondition that enable more complex achievements, such as building cathedrals, then it is in fact quite possible that the existence of such an achievement is a testament to the prevalence of these traits within a population. And not only are the people of that population contributing to these larger achievements with every action taken that reinforces these norms, these preconditions have also likely evolved through the selection pressures of the people of that group in previous generations. Previous generations have taken actions through warfare, reproductive norms, suppression of parasitism, construction of commons, etc., that have shaped these genetic preconditions, societal norms, and thus the achievements of these societies. Which leads to my last criticism of Peterson, this bland and nihilistic leftist assertion that where you find yourself is just an accident. I think it is similar and similarly disingenuous to the way that when religious pundits criticize the theory of evolution, they strawman the theory by claiming that the evolutionary position is that it's all just an accident, when in fact the theory of evolution is that the complexity that we now see in nature is the result of very non-arbitrary selection pressures. There is an element of randomness in the initial biological variations, but the system as a whole and its results are far from random because the selection pressures are the important part and they are far from arbitrary. Well, I think the exact same argument can be made even more strongly about the evolution of the prevalence of genetic traits within populations and therefore the evolution of societal norms and commons which lead to the achievements that we can be proud of. Humans have agency, nature does not. And so what we see within groups is the result of the selective agency of the people from those groups over time. And I think realizing this really highlights the toxicity at the core of Peterson's "you are just an accident" claim. No, your ancestors made choices and they made sacrifices, and whether directly or indirectly, you are the beneficiary of these choices and sacrifices. And even though they didn't know who you would be, they loved what you represent today. The future, a continuation of their values, their lineage and their identity beyond their own death. So in a way, I think that we can say that we inherited the civilization that we have today because we were loved, even if just in the abstract. And what a corrupt rejection of these historical choices and sacrifices to look at their achievements and say, this has nothing to do with me, I came from nowhere, me being here is an accident and I feel no ownership or pride over this whatsoever. Well, Dr. Peterson, in my opinion, you aren't just wrong, you're dead wrong, and it's not good.